"We found someone who can do your job for half of your salary," my manager said after 12 years, sliding the new org chart across the table. I closed my laptop, said "understood," and emptied my desk by lunch. By 3 p.m., my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. It was the CFO. "Why aren't you in the budget meeting? You're the only one who knows these numbers. I want to tell you this story the right way," which means starting not with the org chart, not with the phone call, and not with the conference room full of board members sitting in front of a budget review that couldn't happen because the person who built it had walked out 4 hours earlier. I want to start at the beginning, because the beginning is the only place that makes the ending make sense. My name is Daniel Marsh. I'm 46 years old. I grew up in the Midwest, the kind of place that doesn't produce many finance executives, but does produce people who understand the relationship between work and survival in a specific physical way. My father drove a delivery truck for 31 years for the same regional distributor, not because he loved it, because it was the job that came when he needed a job, and because he was the kind of man who treated work as a commitment rather than a transaction. He was never promoted, never given a raise beyond the standard increment, never recognized publicly or celebrated. He showed up every day, did the work correctly, and came home. I watched that for 18 years and drew a conclusion from it. Not bitterness, something more operational. My father gave that company reliability, institutional knowledge, 31 years of understanding exactly what the roots needed, when to push, when to wait. What the company saw was a line on a payroll report. The gap between those two things, between the reality of what a person contributes and what an institution perceives, was the problem I decided to spend my career understanding. I went to school for accounting, then a master's in financial analysis. I spent my late 20s at a regional firm doing work that was nominally financial analyst work, but was actually diagnostic work, finding the spreadsheets held together with manual workarounds and institutional memory, understanding them, rebuilding them into something that didn't require a specific human being to function, and documenting them well enough that someone else could maintain them. I was good at it. Not because the technical work was complicated, though it was. Because I understood what I was actually doing, translating institutional knowledge from inside someone's head into a form that could survive their absence. That's a specific skill, invisible until it's gone. I was 32 when I joined Forest Capital Group, mid-size financial services holding company. They managed capital structures, participated in credit facilities, provided structured financial products for institutional and commercial clients. The kind of business that produces enormous amounts of financial data across many business lines, and that requires at its core a financial intelligence function that most of the people in the building never see, but that absolutely everyone depends on when decisions need to be made. I came in as a senior financial analyst. Within 2 years, I was running the FP&A function. Within 5 years, I had rebuilt it from the ground up. Within 12 years, I was the institutional memory of everything that function touched. Let me be specific about what that means. It means I knew why the Q3 variance in the commercial lending division looked the way it did, and what had caused it 4 years ago, and how that cause had been partially resolved in the model but never fully reconciled in the underlying data, so there was still a ghost of it running through every projection in that segment. I knew about it. I had flagged it. I had built a manual adjustment layer around it so it didn't corrupt the output. If I left, the adjustment would still run. But the understanding of why it existed and what would happen if the underlying data pattern changed, that understanding was in me. It means I knew that the real occupancy cost for the Northeast region was not the number on the expense report. The report showed the lease cost. The real number was the lease cost minus sublease income from a partial floor we'd been renting since 2020, minus the amortized cost of the tenant improvement allowance from the 2018 lease, which was depreciating through a separate asset line nobody looked at unless they knew to look. The net number was about 23% lower than the gross. Every budget projection I ran used the net number. If someone else ran it without knowing that adjustment, every occupancy-related variance would look wrong and every future projection would be overstated by roughly a quarter. It means I knew that in 2019, during a platform migration, 3 years of historical variance data had been incorrectly mapped to the wrong cost centers in the new system. A patch had been applied that fixed the output numbers without fixing the underlying mapping. If anyone ever tried to run a historical variance analysis below the summary level, the granular data would be wrong in ways invisible from the surface. I had documented this. The documentation lived in a folder I had labeled clearly Critical Data Integrity Notes that I had mentioned in 4 separate all-hands meetings, and that I was, as I later found out, the only person who had ever opened. That's institutional knowledge. Not one piece, not one workaround. Hundreds of them, layered over 12 years of budget cycles, board reviews, platform migrations, structural changes, knowledge that didn't live in documents because it couldn't be fully put into documents, knowledge that lived in the relationship between understanding and experience. My manager had been with the company 16 months. He was a restructuring specialist, the kind of executive who's good at identifying expensive line items and less good at understanding what those line items actually do. He had a mandate to cut costs. I was the most expensive line in the department by a significant margin because my compensation had grown over 12 years in proportion to what the role had grown into. A VP equivalent function that had never been retitled entitled because I had never pushed for it, a mistake I'll come back to. He had identified a candidate, Marcus Chen, 29, strong credentials, recently out of a good MBA program, willing to take the FP&A manager title at roughly 47% of what I was making. On a spreadsheet, the decision looked clean. Remove senior director cost, add manager cost, net savings in the high six figures annually. The spreadsheet did not have a column for institutional knowledge, no row for 12 years of budget cycles, no formula for knowing that the model he was proposing to hand off was, to anyone coming to it fresh, essentially a foreign language. I want to be honest, I saw it coming. Not the specific conversation, but the direction. I had been watching the signals for about 4 months. Fewer invitations to leadership meetings, a new CC structure on email threads that used to include me at the top and now included me further down the list, or not at all. A shift in how my manager responded to my questions, from engaged to brief, from brief to perfunctory. 3 months before the conversation, I put a box in the bottom drawer of my desk, the photograph of my family, the coffee mug my daughter had given me, the small notebook I kept for daily task tracking. I left the box there. Every morning I came in and acknowledged to myself that it was ready, not dramatically, practically. The moment came on a Tuesday in March. He asked me to come by his office at 10. The calendar invite said quick check-in. I've been in this industry long enough to know that quick check-in is a specific kind of lie, the kind management training courses suggest you use to prevent the person being terminated from having time to prepare a response. I noted it. I confirmed the box was in the drawer before I went. His office was on the corner of the 4th floor. He was sitting at the conference table rather than his desk. Another signal. People who want authority sit at their desks. People presenting a decision as a collaborative discussion sit at the conference table. He said a few things about the company's financial position, the ongoing cost review, the importance of right-sizing the organizational structure. I listened. I had heard this preamble before. He slid the org chart across the table. My name was not on it. There was a box where my role had been, labeled FP&A manager, with a name I didn't recognize inside it. He said, "We found someone who can do your job for half of your salary." I looked at the chart for a few more seconds. Then I closed my laptop, said, "Understood," stood up. He looked surprised. I think he'd prepared for negotiation, for the standard sequence of questions. He got a word and a closed laptop. I went back to my desk, filled the box, walked out of the building at 12:47 p.m. I drove home, made a coffee, sat on the back deck and listened to a lawnmower somewhere down the street. I want to tell you honestly what that felt like, because it matters for what came next. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like grief. Not for the job. I had made my peace with that months ago. Grief for the 12 years. For the version of the relationship that had existed in my head, where the work I had built and the value I had created was visible and understood at something close to its actual worth. The conversation in his office had told me something specific. My manager's spreadsheet could see the cost of replacing me. It could not see what was being replaced. Those are different numbers, and they were about to become visible to people whose opinion of the gap between them would matter considerably more. By 1 p.m., the understanding was beginning. The quarterly board review had been on the calendar for 6 weeks. Scheduled for 2 p.m. on the same Tuesday, I walked out. The meeting was the single most important internal financial event of the quarter. Board members flew in for it. The CEO built his remarks around it. The CFO structured her quarterly narrative around its output. And that output, the 12 summary tables, the Q3 variance analysis, the Q4 preliminary projections, the segment-level performance breakdown, the compensation ratio summary, came from a single source, the master budget model I had built and maintained, which lived in a shared drive folder that was, to anyone coming to it fresh, essentially a foreign language. At 1 p.m., the prep team tried to open the model to set up for the 2 meeting. There were 2 of them, both capable analysts who supported the FP&A function. Neither had ever worked inside the model at the level of its internal architecture. They had received outputs from it. They had formatted outputs for the board package. They had run it at my direction, clicked the buttons I told them to click in the sequence I described, and the output appeared. What they had never done was look inside it and understand how the output was produced. The file was called FCG Master Budget Model V47 Current XLSX. The V47 was accurate. 47 major versions, each built on top of the previous one, over 12 years. The first sheet was clean, formatted, readable. The output sheet, which produced the 12 summary tables automatically from data flowing in through 46 other tabs. The problem was the other 46 tabs. To update the model for Q3 required, first, importing source data from 4 separate systems: payroll, the general ledger, the revenue recognition module, and the CRM-linked revenue tracker. 2 of those systems required credentials stored in a password manager I maintained. The password manager credentials were on a system I no longer had access to. My account had been deactivated at 12:47 p.m. as part of the standard termination procedure. The third system used a shared login stored in a team document in a SharePoint folder set up under my account in 2019, also deactivated. The prep team called IT at 1:08 p.m. IT confirmed the deactivation was standard procedure. Access could be restored to specific files, but only through a formal request from a department head. The department head was my manager, who was currently in a meeting on the 3rd floor. They messaged him. He called back at 1:14 p.m. They explained the access problem. He He asked whether the model could be run using Q2 data as a proxy. They said no. Using Q2 data for a Q3 board review was not an option the room would accept. He asked whether the new FP&A manager could help. They reminded him that the new FP&A manager had been told he was starting in 2 weeks and was currently in another city. He called Marcus Chen. Marcus, to his credit, answered immediately and was honest. He had seen the model twice during the hiring process. He understood its general structure. He had not worked in it. From another city, with no source system access and no hands-on familiarity with the model's internal logic, he could not produce the Q3 output in 45 minutes. Even with access, he said, the adjustment logic in the model's data layer would require several hours of walkthrough, not 45 minutes. My manager said he understood and ended the call. At 1:29 p.m., he called HR. He asked whether there was any provision for bringing me back on a consulting basis for the afternoon. HR explained I had been fully processed out at 12:47 p.m. Bringing me back in any capacity required either an emergency contractor agreement or a formal rehire initiation, both of which required a 24-hour processing window through the legal and HR coordination system implemented 2 years ago as part of a compliance update. He asked, what if I just call him and ask him to come in? HR said, you can call him, but he has no obligation to respond, and without a formal agreement in place, the company has exposure. He understood. He hung up. He did not call me at 1:29 p.m. He was still processing the full dimensions of what he had set in motion. At 1:41 p.m., the CFO's assistant messaged the prep team asking whether the board package was on track. They explained the situation. The assistant forwarded it to the CFO. The CFO's name was Patricia Walsh. She had been with the company 9 years. She had worked alongside me for 7 of them. She understood, better than anyone else in the building, what the FP&A function produced and why it mattered. When she read the prep team's message, the one explaining that the FP&A senior director had been let go at noon and the model could not be run without him, she had 2 responses in immediate sequence. The first was a specific kind of controlled professional anger that she was practiced at containing. The second was clear operational understanding of the crisis she was managing. The board meeting in 19 minutes did not have a budget presentation. She called my manager. I wasn't on the call. I've been told it lasted 3 minutes. He did most of the listening. At 1:52 p.m., Patricia sent me a text. It said, Daniel, I need you to call me. It's urgent. I saw it at 1:54 p.m. I was at the kitchen table with my second coffee and a book I'd been meaning to read for 4 months. I read the message, thought about it for about 40 seconds, put the phone down, and kept reading. I want to explain that because it's the decision most people would question. Patricia Walsh was someone I respected professionally and liked personally. She was not responsible for what had happened. She had not been consulted, and she was managing a real operational crisis that I had the ability to resolve. The question of whether to engage immediately or let the situation develop was genuinely complicated. What I concluded in those 40 seconds, the situation needed to be fully visible before it could be correctly addressed. If I called Patricia back at 1:54 p.m. and agreed to come in and run the model, 2 things would happen. The board meeting would be saved, and everyone involved would walk away from the crisis without having understood its full scope. The lesson would be, we cut someone critical, it was uncomfortable for a few hours, it got fixed, let's move on. That was the wrong lesson. And it was the lesson that would produce the next version of the same mistake. Maybe not to me, but to someone else in the organization. Someone whose departure would be handled with the same structural blindness, and whose absence would create a crisis at a moment when the fix wasn't as simple as a phone call. I needed the situation to complete itself before I engaged with it, not out of malice, not to punish anyone. Out of a practical understanding that the only way to change the conditions that produced the mistake was to let the mistake be fully visible before offering the solution. So I kept reading. The board meeting started at 2:00 p.m. Board members seated, CEO at the head of the table, Patricia Walsh at her usual position to his right. My manager was not in the room. He hadn't been invited. This was a leadership meeting. He was on the 4th floor in his office, I later learned, staring at a calendar invite for a 4:00 p.m. call with the VP of operations he had set up 12 minutes earlier. The meeting opened. Patricia explained to the board there was a data preparation issue affecting the Q3 variance presentation and that the meeting would begin with the CEO's strategic remarks while the issue was resolved. The CEO said he understood. He began his remarks. At 2:17 p.m., Patricia's phone buzzed. She looked at it under the table. The prep team, confirming what she already knew. The model could not be run. The source system credentials were deactivated. The department head request to restore them had still not been submitted. She put the phone away and listened to the CEO's remarks for 4 more minutes. Then she said quietly that she needed to step out briefly. In the hallway, she called my manager. 90 seconds. One question. Had he consulted her before making this decision? He said it had gone through the VP of operations for approval. She said that was not what she asked. She ended the call. Then she called me. 2:23 p.m. My phone buzzed. Patricia Walsh, CFO. I didn't answer. 2:31 p.m. Again, I didn't answer. At 2:44 p.m., a text from a number I didn't recognize. Daniel, this is Patricia. I'm calling from a different phone. Please call me back. The board is waiting. 2:51 p.m. She called the unknown number again. I didn't answer. 3:01 p.m. My original phone buzzed. 3:07 p.m. I answered. I was still at the kitchen kitchen table. The book was open. The coffee was cold. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard. "Daniel?" she said. Her voice had a specific quality, not panic. Patricia Walsh did not panic, a controlled steadiness she used when presenting difficult information in board meetings. I had heard it many times. I had never heard it directed at me. "Patricia," I said, "why aren't you in the budget meeting? I was let go this morning." A pause. 3 seconds. The kind of pause that contains a full recalibration. Someone moving a piece of information from the part of the mind that's been managing the operational crisis into the part that understands the full scope of the situation. "You're the only one who knows these numbers," she said. I didn't respond because it wasn't a question. It was the CFO of a major company saying out loud, in the hallway outside a boardroom where the board of directors was currently sitting in front of an empty slot in the agenda, what 47 minutes in a conference room without the right person had demonstrated completely. "I know," I said. A pause. "Is there any way?" she started. "Patricia," I said, "I need you to be direct with me." She said, "What do you need?" That was the right answer. Not, "Can you help us?" Not, "We're in a difficult situation. What do you need?" It told me she understood that the conversation we were having was not about running the model this afternoon. It was a different conversation, and she was willing to have it. "I'd like to meet this evening," I said, "before I decide how to respond to any of this." She named a restaurant near the office. 7 o'clock? "I'll be there," I said. "Daniel," before I could hang up. "Yes, the board is still waiting." "I know," I said. "I'll see you at 7. I ended the call, put the phone on the table. The neighbor's dog had stopped barking. The afternoon was quiet in the specific way afternoons get when something significant has happened and the world doesn't know yet. Between 3:07 p.m. and 7:00 p.m., I thought carefully and without urgency about what I actually wanted, not what I was entitled to, not what leverage I had, not what the market rate for someone with my experience was, though I had a clear sense of all of those things, what I wanted. The question sounds simple. It's not when you answer it honestly. The strategic answer was obvious. I had been terminated without cause after 12 years of demonstrable contribution. The timing had created an immediate, visible operational crisis. The CFO was calling me before the board meeting was even over. Any competent employment attorney would have told me I could walk into that dinner and name almost any number I wanted, but the strategic answer was not the whole answer, because it addressed what I could get, and I was more interested in what outcome would be correct. Not just for me, correct, including for the work I had built, for the people who depended on it, and for an organization I had given 12 years to, which was not an organization I hated. It was an organization that had made a specific, consequential mistake. Organizations make mistakes. The question was, what came next? I thought about my father. 31 years of showing up for a company that never fully understood what he brought. I had spent my career trying to solve that problem for institutions, making institutional knowledge visible, turning what lived in people's heads into documented systems that could survive their absence. And I realized, sitting at my kitchen table, that I had never applied that same discipline to managing my own presence within the organizations I worked for. I had never insisted on a title that reflected what I was actually doing, never pushed for compensation benchmarked to scope, rather than to the title I had accepted 12 years ago and never revisited. Never formally documented my own knowledge base in a way that made its value legible to people who lack the technical vocabulary to assess it independently. That was not my manager's failure. That was mine. I had spent 12 years building a financial architecture everyone depended on and almost nobody could read. I had made myself irreplaceable without making myself legible. Those are not the same thing. And the distinction between them is the difference between what happened to me on Tuesday and what should have happened. Irreplaceability, I understood now, is not the goal. Legibility is. When you are the only person who can do something, you are simultaneously irreplaceable and vulnerable. The irreplaceability is real. The vulnerability is that the moment someone decides to attempt the replacement, the consequences fall on the organization and on you with equal force. The protection against that is not making yourself harder to replace. It's building the work in a way that can be understood and inherited, documented clearly enough that a capable successor can carry it forward. I arrived at the restaurant at 6:58. Patricia Walsh was already there. She did not waste time on pleasantries. "What happened today was wrong," she said. "Not just operationally. The process that allowed a termination at this level to occur without my knowledge or the CEO's was a structural failure, and it's one I should have caught. I appreciate that. I'm not looking for absolution," she said. "I'm telling you what I believe so you know where we're starting from." That directness was one of the things I had always respected about her. She did not manage around difficult truths. "What happened in the meeting?" I said. "The board was told there was a data preparation issue." The CEO covered with his strategic remarks. "We were in the room about 40 minutes before I called a break. We've rescheduled the Q3 review for next Tuesday. And my manager. He had a conversation with me. He'll have another with the CEO tomorrow morning." I did not ask for details. "I'd like you to come back," Patricia said, directly, without preamble. "I have conditions." I expected that. "Tell me." I had spent the afternoon writing them in my notebook. 4. I had gone back and forth on whether 4 was too many. I decided 4 was right because all 4 were necessary and none of them were punitive. They were structural corrections to real problems. First, title. My role for several years has been VP equivalent in scope and has been titled Senior Director. The title needs to accurately reflect Correct, the scope. Vice President of Financial Planning and Analysis. She nodded. No negotiation. Second, compensation. Market rate adjustment for the VP title. Benchmarked to a VP of FP&A at a company of our size and complexity. I've done the research. I'm not asking for the top of the range. I'm asking for the midpoint. Send me the benchmark data tonight. Third, I said, a knowledge documentation project. Formally sanctioned, fully resourced, defined timeline. The goal is to take every piece of institutional knowledge currently living in my head and translate it into written documentation that a capable successor could use to operate the function without me. Model documentation, process narratives, data integrity notes, adjustment logic, historical context, all of it. When it's complete, the function should be able to survive my departure without a crisis. She looked at me. You're asking us to invest in your replaceability. I'm asking you to invest in the function's resilience. Those are different things. I'm not going anywhere. But the situation that happened today, where the absence of one person could paralyze a board review, should never be able to happen again. The documentation project fixes that. It protects the company. It also protects me, because it means what I've built has a life beyond my presence in it. She nodded. Fourth, the authority to make FP&A headcount decisions at the senior director level or above needs to sit with the CFO office, not with a restructuring manager, not with a VP of operations approving what looks like a budget line item with you. That's already being changed. I want it formal, in writing, part of the organizational structure documentation. Done, she said. We ordered. The conversation over the next hour was not a negotiation in the conventional sense, more like a calibration. She asked questions about the documentation project, about scope and sequencing and resourcing. I answered specifically. She pushed back on the timeline once. I told her 8 months was realistic and that under-resourcing it would defeat the purpose. She accepted that. She asked about Marcus Chen. I said, he's talented. He should stay. He should learn the model under my supervision rather than being dropped into a role he wasn't given time to prepare for. In 6 months, he'll know more about the function than most people in his position would know in 2 years. Is that workable for you? Working alongside him while you do the documentation? It's the right outcome for the function, for him, for the company. My pride is not the relevant consideration. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, can I tell you something? I said, yes. You've been here 12 years. I've worked with you for 7 of them. In those 7 years, I don't think I ever asked you what you wanted. Not what you needed for a project. What you wanted. Where you saw yourself going. I didn't answer immediately. I don't know if it would have changed anything, she said. But it's a conversation we should have had. I said, I didn't make it easy to have. I kept my head down and did the work and assumed the work would speak for itself. That's not a model for building a career that's visible in the right ways. She said, we both learned something today. Expensively, I said. She almost smiled. Very. The dinner lasted 2 hours. When we left, she said the CEO would want to speak with me directly. Robert Fabian called me the next morning at 9 a.m. He didn't wait until Monday. Daniel, I owe you an apology. I know. I'm giving you one. What happened on Tuesday was a failure of process, and it resulted in an outcome that was wrong. I should have known about this decision before it was made. I didn't. And that reflects a structural gap we're fixing. But more than that, I want to tell you directly. The work you've done for this company over 12 years has been seen and valued, even when the structure around it failed to reflect that accurately. I appreciate that, Robert. Patricia tells me you have 4 conditions. I sent her the compensation benchmark data last night. I saw it. All 4 conditions are accepted. All 4. All 4. The title, the compensation, the documentation project, the authority structure change. We'll have the formal documentation ready before you come back Monday. Monday, I said. Monday, he said. Monday morning I came back to the building. The badge they issued me had a different title on it. Vice President, Financial Planning and Analysis. A small thing. Not a small thing. The rescheduled Q3 board review happened the following Tuesday. 1 week exactly after the Tuesday I had walked out. I spent Monday morning reconnecting the data feeds, restoring access to the source systems, running the import process, applying the adjustment logic from the model's data layer, updating the calculation layers for Q3, running the Q4 projection logic, validating output against the variance notes, and producing the 12 summary tables for the board package. I had it formatted, reviewed, and printed by early afternoon. I left a copy on Patricia's desk with a note that said, ready for tomorrow. She wrote back, thank you. See you at 8. The board meeting the following morning was, from a financial presentation standpoint, routine. The Q3 variances were what they were, but the Q4 projections were the most clearly structured projection narrative I had presented to the board in 3 years. I had spent the weekend rethinking not just what the numbers said, but how to organize the presentation. I restructured the executive summary to lead with the 3 decisions the Q4 outlook required, rather than with the Q3 historical summary, because the Q3 numbers were behind us, and the Q4 projections were what the board needed to act on. It was a small structural change. It produced the clearest strategic discussion we'd had in 2 years. Robert Fabian stopped me in the hallway afterward and said it was exactly what the room needed. That was the work. The work that a spreadsheet had decided could be performed at 47% of the cost. The knowledge documentation project began 3 weeks after I came back. I had spent the intervening weeks preparing a project plan I presented to Patricia and the new VP of Operations. The project outlined 11 documentation deliverables. The master budget model user guide, a narrative explanation of the model's architecture, architecture, how the layers connect, why it's structured the way it is, and what the known data integrity issues are and how they've been managed. 40 pages. The Data Source Integration Guide. Complete description of the 4 source systems that feed the model, how to pull the exports, what format the data arrives in, what the adjustment logic is doing and why, and what to do when a source system produces unexpected output. 22 pages. The Variance Analysis Framework. The conceptual foundation of how we think about budget versus actual variances, what the standard explanatory categories are, which variances require investigation, and the list of recurring variance items that have historical context not visible in the numbers themselves. 31 pages. The Multi-Year Projection Methodology. How we build forward projections, what assumptions we use and where they come from, how we calibrate them against actual results, and what the known sources of projection error are. 28 pages. The Segment-Level Data Notes. A segment-by-segment description of the business-specific knowledge required to interpret each segment's financial performance accurately, including the historical events and structural decisions that affect how each segment's numbers look and what they mean. 47 pages. The Compensation Ratio Tracking Tool Guide. How the tool works, why the one-period lag catch-up layer exists, and how to maintain it if the payroll system changes its export format. 16 pages. The Historical Data Integrity Notes. A complete inventory of known data issues in the historical record, including the 2019 platform migration mapping error, with explanations of where they live, what they affect, and the current management approach for each. 19 pages. The Board Presentation Production Guide. Step-by-step instructions for producing the quarterly board package, including the list of things to check before anything goes to the printer. 12 pages. The Annual Budget Process Playbook. A month-by-month description of the annual budget cycle, what happens in each phase, who's involved, what the FP&A function is responsible for producing at each stage. 33 pages. The External Reporting Coordination Guide. How we work with the external audit team, what they need, when they need it, and the recurring items that require FP&A involvement. 20 pages. The FP&A Function Overview. A non-technical narrative description of what the function does, why it exists, what it produces, and who depends on it and for what. Written to be readable by a senior leader who doesn't have a financial analysis background. 15 pages, 11 documents, approximately 283 pages, all of it previously living in various forms inside my head. The project took 8.5 months, 2 longer than I had estimated, 1 longer than Patricia had pushed back on. The reason it always takes longer than estimated is that writing down what you know forces you to discover what you know that you didn't know you knew. Every section I sat down to write connected to something else, which connected to a third thing that couldn't be documented without first documenting the first and second. The knowledge was not a list, it was a web. Documenting a web requires understanding its shape before you can describe it. Marcus Chen read every document as I produced it. He asked excellent questions, the kind that came from someone reading carefully and finding the places where the documentation was accurate but incomplete. When he flagged those places, I went back and filled them in. By the time the project was complete, Marcus had read 283 pages of model documentation and worked alongside me through 3 full budget cycles, 2 board reviews, and 1 external audit. He knew the model, not the way I knew it. That takes years of cycles, not months, but well enough that the function would not stop without me. Slower at first, more error-prone at the margins, but it would not stop. That was the outcome I had wanted, not his failure, his success, but with the time and support the role actually required, rather than a title and a budget cut and good luck. My manager stayed approximately 5 months after I returned. His authority over headcount decisions had been formally transferred to the CFO office, which significantly reduced the scope of what he was there to do. His departure was described internally as mutual. I believe it was not mutual in any meaningful sense. I felt nothing specific about that. No satisfaction, no guilt. The outcome was the natural consequence of a mistake that had been expensive and visible. The institution had absorbed the lesson and made the structural correction. What I had a stake in was the work, and the work was intact. More than intact. The documentation project had made it more durable than it had ever been. The institution was stronger for having survived the crisis than it had been before, in the specific way that systems become stronger when their failure points are discovered and addressed rather than remaining hidden. I left Forest Capital Group 2 years after returning, on my own terms, at a time I chose, for a role that was the right next thing. My departure was planned. My transition took 4 months. I spent those months working alongside Marcus, transferring remaining knowledge that hadn't made it into the written documentation, and walking him through 1 more full budget cycle before I went. The board review in my final month was run by Marcus. He produced the package. He presented the Q3 variance analysis. He handled the board's Q4 projection questions. He was not perfect. He had 2 years of experience and I had 14, but he was solid. The board had clean data in front of them, and they made good decisions with it. Patricia Walsh caught my eye across the table when he finished the variance presentation. She gave a small nod. I gave one back. That was the moment I understood what the whole thing had been for. Not the org chart on a Tuesday in March, not the phone calls from the back deck, not the dinner dinner or the CEO's apology or the VP title on the badge. Those were events. What the whole thing had been for was this: a function that didn't need me anymore, a financial architecture that would keep working after I was gone, a person who had been given the time and the support and the documentation he needed to do the work correctly, the work outlasting me. That's what I went back for. I want to say one more thing. For anyone listening who has spent years building something inside an organization while watching the people making budget decisions fail to understand what they're looking at, the gap between what a person's contribution is worth and what an institution can perceive about that worth is real. It's not going away. Institutions are not good at valuing things that can't be easily represented on a spreadsheet. And institutional knowledge, the real kind, the accumulated kind, is exactly the kind of thing that doesn't show up cleanly as a line item. But the answer to that gap is not to make yourself harder to replace. The answer is to make yourself legible. Document what you know. Write down the things that live only in your head. Build the systems that can survive you rather than systems that require you. Not because you're planning to leave, because the work deserves to outlast your presence in it. Because the people who depend on what you've built deserve a version of it that doesn't collapse when you're unavailable. Because you deserve the kind of contribution that is valued, not because a crisis made it impossible to ignore, but because you built it to be seen. That's the difference between irreplaceability, which makes you indispensable, and legibility, which makes you valuable. The first one is fragile. The second one isn't. My father drove a delivery truck for 31 years. The company he drove for never fully understood what they had in him. When he retired, they gave him a card and a modest pension. The institutional perception of his worth was the cost of his salary and the cost of his replacement. That was not the full account of what he brought. I understood that watching him. I spent 12 years trying to solve that problem for organizations. And then I turned around and made a version of the same mistake myself. I kept the knowledge in my head and trusted that the quality of the output would speak for itself. It was visible in the results. It was not visible in the way that mattered when someone with a restructuring mandate and a spreadsheet was deciding which line items to cut. The documentation project was the most important professional work I've done. Not 12 years of budget cycles. The documentation project, because it's the one that took everything else and made it legible. That made the work outlast me. That's the version of a professional contribution that actually holds. The board meeting on my last month was clean. The numbers were right. The room made good decisions. I walked out of that building for the last time not carrying a box in a hurry, but on a regular afternoon with time to say proper goodbyes, knowing that what I had spent 14 years building was going to keep running after I left. That's the whole story, except for one thing. A few months after I left, I ran into my former manager at an industry event. I almost didn't recognize him. He was consulting now, working with a smaller firm. We made eye contact. He walked over. "Daniel," he said. "Hello. I heard you left earlier this year." He said, "I've thought a lot about what happened. I waited. I was wrong, not just about the process, about my understanding of what you held. I had a model of what the role was, and I never tested it against the reality. That's on me." I looked at him for a moment, then I said, "Okay." He seemed to expect more. I didn't have more to give him. The anger was gone. The warmth wasn't there either. What I had was a clear recollection of a Tuesday afternoon and everything that followed, and a clear sense that the account between us was settled, not by design, but by the natural consequence of events. We talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular. Then we went our separate ways. The whole truth of what had happened was not in that conversation, and not in the org chart, and not in the phone calls from the back deck. The whole truth was in 283 pages sitting in the FE&A reference library at Forest Capital Group, in 11 documents that took 8.5 months to write, in a model that still runs, in a function that still works, in work that outlasted the person who built it. That's where it lives, and that's where it should live.